The snowstorm hit without warning, its icy claws scratching at the windows of a small cabin tucked to the edge of a forgotten town. Mark Matthews, a quiet mechanic and single father, never expected that the night would change the course of his life. When he answered the desperate knock on his door, he wasn't just inviting a stranger inside. He was welcoming a new beginning, though he had no way of knowing it. Before we begin this journey, consider subscribing to our channel for more stories that touch the heart. Sometimes, the quietest moments carry the heaviest weight. The stories you are about to hear might feel familiar, but in the smallest gestures, we often find the most powerful transformations. Please consider subscribing. Now let's begin. It was a kind of night where the skies swallowed the world whole, where snow piled up like forgotten memories, thick and suffocating. Mark sat in his worn-out armchair, his only company the low hum of a broken heater and the distant crackle of a radio that had long outlived its usefulness. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, but to Mark, time seemed to stand still, caught in the rhythm of his own solitude. Inside, his little girl Lily slept soundly in her room, a soft, contented breath escaping her tiny body every few moments. Mark's hands were rough from a lifetime of working metal, tightening bolts and fixing machines. But tonight, they felt more like tools for survival than anything else. He could feel the cold seeping into the walls of the cabin, and yet there was a certain warmth in the air, a quiet kind of peace that had become rare for him. Just as he was about to pour himself another cup of lukewarm coffee, the sound of a knock echoed through the cabin. Mark didn't know it yet, but that knock was the sound of fate calling him out of his quiet life, pulling him into a world of chaos, danger, and unexpected love. He stood, his boots scraping the wooden floor, and moved toward the door. He expected a neighbor, maybe someone seeking refuge from the storm, or a stranded traveler looking for shelter. He was unprepared for the girl standing on his doorstep. Her face was pale, her hair tangled with snow, and her eyes, those eyes, spoke of something deeper, something heavier than just a cold. She was a teenager, no more than 17, but she carried the weight of the world in her fragile frame. She shivered, and in her arms, she held a small, battered bag, the kind that looked like it had been through more than its fair share of storms. I'm sorry to bother you, she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. I don't have anywhere else to go. Please, I need help. Mark, ever the quiet man, didn't hesitate. The storm was fierce, and no one should be out there alone. Without thinking twice, he stepped aside, letting her in. His eyes scanned her face, noting the way her lips trembled, how her clothes were damp with snow, how her hands shook as she clutched the bag to her chest. "You're safe now," Mark said, his voice steady but his heart uncertain. "Come in. You can warm up by the fire." The girl nodded, relief washing over her face as she stepped inside. Mark led her to the small living room, his eyes lingering on her for just a moment before he asked, "What's your name?" "Jade," she said, her voice barely audible, as she sank into the chair he offered. Mark could see that she was exhausted, her eyes hollow and dark, like she hadn't had a proper night's rest in days. But there was something else, something hidden behind that exhaustion, something that Mark couldn't quite put his finger on. And as she looked up at him, her eyes caught his for just a second before she looked away, as if there was something she wasn't ready to share. The storm outside matches the one inside. As Mark set about heating up some soup for dinner, the storm outside raged harder. Snowflakes swirled in frantic circles, and the wind howled, pounding against the cabin like a beast locked out in the cold. The light from the small fireplace cast long shadows on the walls, but the warmth was a comfort. It was the first time in a long while that Mark felt something other than the cold, something that wasn't related to the endless mechanical work he had spent his days doing. Jade sat by the fire, her hands wrapped around a steaming bowl of soup, but she barely touched it. Her eyes were fixed on the flames, and every now and then, Mark could see her shiver, as if the cold inside her was worse than the one outside. He didn't ask her what had happened, what had brought her to his doorstep. He knew better than to push someone too soon, especially when they were already so clearly broken. But just as the silence between them began to feel too thick, too heavy, Jade spoke. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I didn't know where else to go. I don't know how I got here." Mark nodded, his brow furrowing as he watched her. You're welcome here. You're safe now. We'll get you through this storm, and then we'll figure it out. A twist in the storm. As the night deepened and the snow continued to fall, Mark found himself unable to sleep. The storm outside seemed to seep into his bones, and Jade's words, her haunted eyes, kept echoing in his mind. There was something about her, something familiar, something that stirred a memory deep within him. It wasn't until the next morning that Mark would discover just how far fate's hand had reached. The storm had passed, the sky clearing up to reveal a brittle blue, and the world outside was calm once again. Mark stepped outside to gather some wood, but when he returned to the cabin, something was different. Jade was gone. He found her bag still sitting on the chair by the fire, but Jade was nowhere to be found. Panic surged in his chest, and he grabbed his jacket, rushing outside to search for her. As he moved toward the woods, something caught his eye, a small piece of paper sticking out from under the door. It was a note, hastily written. "I'm sorry. I didn't want you to know, but I had to leave. It's better this way. You'll understand one day. Jade." Mark stood frozen, the note clutched in his hand, as the weight of her words pressed down on him. What had he missed? What was the secret she was running from? And why had she left him behind so suddenly? As Mark looked toward the horizon, a chill ran down his spine. He had no idea what Jade was running from, but he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't just let her go. But little did he know the truth about Jade, about her past, and the secret she was keeping would soon bring Mark face to face with something far more dangerous than he could have ever imagined. Mark stood frozen, the note in his hand like a weight that could crush him. Jade had left, and with her departure, she had taken the only thing he had come to care about in so many years. Hope. Hope that life, despite the wreckage of loss and routine, could still surprise him. And now it was gone. He couldn't breathe for a second. His feet seemed glued to the snow-covered porch, his hands trembling from the sudden rush of emotions. What had she meant by this? Why had she left so abruptly? Mark thought back to the night before. Had there been a sign? A gesture that he missed? The storm had blinded them both. But Jade, the girl who had knocked on his door, so broken, so fragile, she wasn't just running from the storm. She was running from something much darker. The first thing Mark did was go to the shed. It felt like the logical place to start, the place where he had first dug deep into his past to bring out the one thing that had been sitting idle for so long, the old helicopter. The Bell 206, a relic from his younger days when he and his brother Ethan had flown rescue missions for National Guard. Mark had sworn he'd never touch it again. But tonight was different. The storm was still heavy in the air, thick clouds hanging over the horizon as if they were holding something back. Mark walked across the frozen earth toward the shed, the cold biting at his skin, his breath coming out in invisible puffs. But this wasn't just about survival. It was about answers. And he wasn't going to let Jade slip away without understanding why she had left, and why she had come to him in the first place. He opened the shed door with a groan, the metal hinges protesting against the winter chill. The light from his lantern flickered weakly as he moved inside. The helicopter was exactly where he had left it, beneath a layer of dust, its once sleek exterior now faded and chipped, but still there. The memory of his brother's laughter, his insistence that they'd be a great team in the air, flooded back. Ethan had been a free spirit, always looking for the next adventure, the next challenge. And he had always brought Mark along for the ride. But that was before the crash. The crash that had stolen his brother. The crash that had broken something inside Mark he hadn't been able to fix. As Mark made his way to the helicopter, his hands trembling from both the cold and the flood of memories, he found himself wondering about Jade. What was she running from? Why had she chosen him, of all people, to find in the storm? What was in that bag she carried? And what was the secret she was hiding? Mark had no answers, only questions. And he wasn't about to stop until he found them. The hidden past. Hours later, Mark had managed to get the helicopter started. It had been slow, and the engine sputtered more than once, but muscle memory kicked in, and the old bird roared back to life. It was a small miracle, considering how long it had been sitting unused, gathering dust in the shed. But Mark didn't care about miracles. He cared about answers. The sky was dark, but the lights of the town below twinkled faintly, marking the path to the ridge where Jade had disappeared. He flew low, feeling the vibrations in the cockpit beneath his hands. The storm was still raging, and he could barely see through the windshield. It wasn't like before, when flying had been second nature, when he and Ethan had flown together without a second thought. But tonight, everything was different. The way of the past, the mystery of Jade, it all pressing on him, making every turn of the rollerblades feel like a step further into a world he hadn't known he was part of. His mind wandered back to Jade. Who was she really? Why had she shown up on his doorstep like that? Why had she been so desperate, so scared? There had been something haunting in her eyes, a look that Mark couldn't shake. And now she was gone. But her absence felt like a gaping wound he didn't know how to heal. As the ridge came into view, Mark's heart skipped a beat. There, at the base of a large pine tree, was something that glowed faintly through the swirling snow. Mark's grip tightened on the controls as he lowered the helicopter, searching the ground below. There it was, a crumpled yellow school bus. Its windshield shattered, one side buried under a thick blanket of snow. The emergency door flung wide open. Inside the doorway, a woman lay half-conscious, her bloodied face pale, her eyes barely open. Clara Monroe. Mark's stomach twisted. This was the woman from the radio call. She had been with Jade, hadn't she? He had to land the helicopter, and quickly. The wind howled louder as he circled lower, his heart hammering in his chest. What had happened? Where was Jade? Why was Clara alone? He touched down with a jolt, the skid scraping the uneven ground beneath. His heart raced as he threw open the door and leapt out, snow instantly biting at his legs. He ran toward Clara, his breath coming in quick gasps. "Clara!" he shouted as he reached her, his hands immediately going to her waist to support her. "Hold on, I'm here to help." She barely looked at him, her eyes glazed with exhaustion, but she nodded weakly as he lifted her into his arms. Her body trembled violently from the cold, and her lips were blue, blood staining her temple where a cut had opened. Mark didn't waste a second. He scooped her up, carrying her toward the helicopter, his mind a whirlwind of questions. What had happened? Where was Jade? His pulse quickened as he placed Clara inside the chopper, trying to start the engine again. This time, it caught, the blade spinning rapidly as the chopper groaned back to life. They were barely off the ground when Clara spoke again, her voice rasping and weak. She's not breathing right. She's still in the bus," she whispered, her words barely audible over the sound of the rotor blades. "Please, you have to go back for her." Mark's heart plummeted into his stomach. Jade, she was still out there, and Clara, she had been trying to save her. But the storm, the thick snow, everything was against him. He couldn't see, couldn't fly blind in this madness. The thought of losing her, losing Jade, made his head spin. He clenched his jaw. "Stay with me, Clara. I'll get you to safety first, and then we'll come back. You have to trust me." She nodded weakly, tears slipping down her cheeks as she held on to him for dear life. The storm swirled around them, but Mark pushed forward, his heart a tangled mess of fear and determination. He wouldn't lose Jade. Not now, not after everything. But as they flew through the blinding snow, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't just flying through the storm. He was flying towards something he wasn't prepared for. A secret, a hidden truth, something about Jade that no one, not even her, had known. It wasn't until they landed in the nearby town's clinic that Mark would learn the truth. The storm had taken its toll, and both Clara and Jade were being rushed into separate rooms for care. But as Mark sat in the waiting room, his thoughts were a whirlwind. Why had Jade run? What had she been hiding? And why had she come to him? Just as he sat, lost in thought, the clinic doors opened and a nurse appeared, her eyes wide with urgency. "Mr. Matthews, there's something you need to see," she said, her voice trembling. Mark stood quickly, his heart racing. "What's going on?" "Jade, she's awake," the nurse said. "She's asking for you." Mark's blood ran cold. Jade was awake, and when he stepped into that room, he would finally know what she was running from. But when he opened the door, Jade's eyes locked onto his, and for the first time, there was no fear. only the quiet acceptance of someone who had seen too much, someone who had known more than they were ready to share. And then she spoke the words that would change everything. I'm not who you think I am. If you want to discover the truth behind Jade's past and the secret that has haunted her, make sure to subscribe and turn on your notifications for the next part of this story. The journey has just begun, and the truth is darker than you could ever imagine.